Shalom, this is Rabbi Adam Law from Toronto Lights and Or Yisrael. This week's Parsha is Parshas Vayashev. Parshas Vayashev is a very difficult Parsha to understand. It shows that the Jewish people can fall to such lows, but what's crazy is, like the story of Hanukkah, is that out of that lowness comes a great possibility of redemption. Now, why is it called Vayashev? It says that Yaakov had struggle after struggle after struggle. First, he had the struggles with Esau, already from inside the womb of Rivka, as they were trying to tear the umbilical cord one from the other one. And then he had the struggle for the Bechorah and for the Bracha. Then, when he got the Bracha from his brother that Yitzhak gave him instead of Esau, he had to flee for his life and go into a strange land with no money, with no idea what was supposed to be. And there Eliphaz, the son of Esau, confronted him, and Yaakov was almost killed there. Then he had to struggle for 20 years. After learning for 14 years, he had a relatively time of peace there, though he didn't sleep because he learned Torah there. He learned Torah to such a high degree that it changed his whole personality, and he became mamash, the epitome of Torah in the world. Nevertheless, he didn't sleep, and he worked so hard. And then he had to go 20 years into business in Lavan's house, dealing with the trickster Lavan to earn the right to marry Rachel and Leah, and then finally to have his own flocks. And then he had to run away in the middle of the night because he was afraid that Lavan was not going to give him what was due to him, and he had to escape with his whole family, cross over back into Eretz Yisrael, which was promised to him. And he was in doubt the whole time. As we spoke about in last week's Parsha of Yishlach, we didn't know whether Yaakov was going to get the bracha or not. And that's why in the end, when he defeated the angel of Esau, the Yetzer Hara, also that's found inside of Yaakov, when he defeats it, he asked for the bracha. He asked for the bracha because he was in such doubt over whether he had the right to take the bracha in the first place. But before that, he makes a deal with Lavan and settles affairs there, goes into Eretz Yisrael and has this tremendous confrontation with the angel of Esau, which also represents his inner evil inclination. And then he has to confront Esau himself. Not to mention the instance with Dinah and Shimon and Levi killing the residents of Shechem. Finally, after all this, Vayashev, Yaakov says, I've landed here and I have all my children. Let's not forget also the last struggle of losing his beloved wife Rachel with the birth of the 12th child, Binyamin, who's actually named Ben Oni by Rachel, meaning as the son of my affliction. But Yaakov realizes that despite all the pain and suffering that he has finally achieved the prophecy that he received according to the Kedusha Levi in Parshas Vayetze, when the 12 rocks combined into one, he knew he was going to have 12 sons, and those 12 sons were going to build his holy nation. So despite all this suffering and travail, he finally felt he had arrived. Regarding this, the Midrash says, it's not enough that tzaddikim have peace in the world to come, they also want peace in this world. And then the worst of all possible afflictions came to Yaakov. The loss of his son, the Ben Zakunim Yosef, who was beloved and more talented than all the other children. So I want to learn a little bit exactly what happened with Bechiras Yosef, and the absolutely unexplainable idea that how could the holy brothers sell Yosef and actually originally want to kill him? How could they do such a thing? It's unbelievable. Now, in exploring this topic, numerous questions have come up from friends of mine about studying the topic of the Avos and being critical of the Avos. We know the derech of Torah is to understand the Avos were enlightened people who were the highest people who ever existed, and that is why they were able to bring the enlightened nation of Israel into the world. However, when you read the Torah, it does seem there is a little bit of flaws that can sometimes appear. So one of the answers we give is it may be that there are flaws, but those flaws are exterior, and compared to the flaws of people nowadays, they're very, very, very minimal. And it's not that they are flawed, it's that we learn from their character growth. Meaning, if there wasn't some sort of little bit of something that needed fix, where would we go? What could get better? We need to understand that this is not these idolatrous religions where everybody is perfect and these perfect beings came down into the world. These are people who are real people who are struggling with the mission that God gave them. And then when they fulfill their mission through all these numerous tests and struggles, we learn from their character growth exactly how high and to what heights people can achieve. So therefore, sometimes it appears that Midrashim may seem like they are critical in some way, and even the Torah itself may seem critical. But the rabbis go to great lengths to understand that these people were very, very, very high, elevated beings, and that what looked to us like things that were problems really were just the process of character growth in order for them to build a binyan adei ad, to build a framework for the Jewish people to continue throughout all time. And indeed, as the Gemara says, Hein Avos Merkava. The Avos were the Merkava, the chariot for bringing down God's glory in the world. They were the ones to bring the nation into fruition, from an idea, a supernal idea that existed from before creation, to actually come into reality with the birth of the Jewish people through the Avos. So let's get into a little bit on the Mechiras Yosef. Now, the obvious question that needs to be asked here is, how could it be that the brothers would want to do such a thing? So I want to speak a little bit about a three-tiered stage of how people become Jewish people. At the beginning of all time, from Adam on, it was very, very clear that everybody in the world had a knowledge of God. But the Rambam brings down that from the time of Enosh on, people would take the servants of God, i.e. the moon, the stars, the sun, plants, trees, water, and they would say, hey, if these guys are ministers of God, if there's somebody that serves God, maybe they also are worth serving in some way. And so at first it was a little bit not such a bad thought. They said, you know what, these ideas are also deserving of honor. But after time that degraded. They degraded to the point where people actually worshipped idols completely and thought the idols were something. And that's where Avraham turned it around. Things were so far gone by the time of Avraham that there was very little sign in the world of monotheism at all. And that Avram had to use his intellect to destroy the idols of his father and to reason, as we see in the Gemaras, that behind all these physical objects like the sun, the moon, the stars, the water, the trees, that there was a God there, and he was the only one worth worshipping. This idea was further brought into being by the yeshivas of Shem and Aver, which were the only other monotheists at the time. And Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov all had their relationships with Shem and Aver, and from them they started bringing in this world of the Jewish people. Shem and Aver, though, were not considered Jews. They were pure monotheists, but the actual light of the hidden light of the Torah was only brought into being from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So at first, it was just whoever was Re'ui, whoever was fitting, would become part of the nation. We see that Avraham gave even a Shema Tuma, an impure name, to some of his sons, because he realized that some of his sons were not fitting to receive the brachas of Hashem, to be part of the Nachala, part of the inheritance of Hashem. And we see that Yishmael also, though he was to become a monotheist in a way, also because of his bad behavior, was not Re'ui to be part of the blessed of Hashem. So too Yitzhak, who was the one who did receive the Nachala from Hashem. He had one son, Esav, who, though he had great potential, as we spoke about in Toldos, ended up besmirching himself completely and went off completely and literally became the side of evil in the world, and thus not befitting of God's light. So each one of these Avos, though, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, married holy women who they brought under the tent and under the wings of the Shekhinah, and they were able to bring the nation into fruition through them. By the time we got to Yaakov, though, Yaakov was an Ish Shalem, an Ish Tam, a Gever Shalem, as the Holy Sfarim say. He was the one who the shmutz of Yishmael and Esav had already been removed, and he was perfect from all sides, though he still needed to overcome the tests within his holy side. Nevertheless, Yaakov was perfect, and therefore all of his children were perfect, and all 12 of the tribes were indeed holy. So at that time, it was actually a patriarchal, meaning is all of the 12 sons, whoever they married, would become part of the religion, and you just needed to have a Jewish father. However, at the time of the giving of the Torah, according to most opinions, for some reason which Sarik needs more explanation, it turned over that the mother would be the one to transmit the idea of being Jewish, though there was still the idea of tribes being affiliated through the 12 tribes to the father. Nevertheless, the idea of being Jewish, according to the Gemara, was transmitted through the mother from the time on. So to answer initially, why did the brothers hate Yosef so much? The Sfarim say they felt Yosef was a rodef. We know that the Gemara says that Yosef used to bring bad reports to the father. Actually, the Torah says that about the boys. And they actually felt that he was trying to get them kicked out. He was trying to get them kicked out of the covenant. He was constantly being looked bad, and they were afraid that Yaakov would give the blessing to Yosef. Furthermore, Yaakov did seem to favor Yosef quite a bit. He was a ben zekunim, meaning he was a beloved son who looked exactly like him, like Yaakov. As it says, these are the generations, the toldos of Yaakov, Yosef. Meaning he had the exact same diukna, he had the exact same appearance as his father Yaakov. They learned Torah together. He favored him with the ketonos pasim, with the multicolored coat, the beautiful coat and clothes, and he had a favored role, particularly after the death of Rachel, where we see that Yosef was really the one who Yaakov favored. This despite the fact that we see that the favoring that was shown in previous generations, like according to the interpretation of Rabbi Hirsch, for Yitzhak's favoritism of Esav and Rivka's for Yaakov, and the fact they were mechanik them exactly the same way when each one needed their own special education according to the pasuk Chanuk Na'ar al pi darko. Nevertheless, we see that Yaakov knew Yosef was a very special child. In the end, indeed, we saw that he was a very special child. But if you can say such a thing, there would seem to be some problem with this, that Yaakov would favor Yosef, because the brothers were not aware that Yaakov had completely perfected himself, and that all 12 of the sons were going to get a portion, and each one of them were going to have the holy place within the supernal, sephirotic realm, and each one of them would become the chariots through which the Jewish people would come through. They were afraid that Esav and Yishmael, that would also become to them. That if they were constantly proven that they were bad to their father, then Yosef would get the bracha, and they would all be kicked out, and Yosef would become the Jewish people. They knew in their hearts they were also befitting of brachas, and therefore they had deep, deep issues with the things Yosef was doing. For Yosef's part, he did indeed say negative things to the father. However, it was not lashon hara, because Yosef was, though he was, if you could say such a thing, slightly mistaken about his opinion about the boys, he saw things which appeared to him were not befitting, and he wanted to tell his father Yaakov what they were doing in order that Yaakov should be mochiach them. However, the brothers of Leah were very, very strong, and they had their own little clan, and they were the popular, cool ones that were not able to necessarily easily take tochacha from the father, like the other boys were. The sons of Bilhah and Zilpah were more modest because they came from the Shvachot, and Yosef was much closer to the father. Binyamin was still very young at this time, so he doesn't play as much of a role until later on in the story of the sale of Yosef. What's an example of the kind of mistake that Yosef would see when he saw the brothers? An example of that would be when Yosef walked and saw the brothers eating ever min achai. He saw him eating a limb from an animal that was still bouncing around and jumping around. And we know from the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach that it is indeed forbidden to tear a limb off an animal and eat it. However, Yosef only saw this from a distance because he was not really close to these brothers, and he did not realize what really had happened. Really, in the tents of Shem ve'Aver, 3 types of Torah were taught. One, according to Tiva Shalom, was Perki Avos, was Menshalkite, the 5th Shulchan Aruch, was things that were taught. And another answer was the lights of the mitzvahs and Torah and everything may have been in a different form, but the other answer was they were learned in the deepest secrets of Kabbalah. That Avram wrote the Sefer Yetzirah from the supernal wisdom that was handed down through the generations, from Adam, so the Sefer Tolos Adam, to Noach in the Tzohar, according to the Sfarim, this is the way it went down, and through generations, and Avram wrote it down in a book called the Sefer Yetzirah. That book and that knowledge was transferred to Yitzhak and Yaakov and eventually to the boys. And the boys actually created an animal using the secret powers of God's names, the 22 letters, the 10 spheros, and they actually created an animal. And therefore, this animal did not need shechita, it did not need shechting, because it actually was not an animal that was a live animal from a live birth. And therefore, it was almost like a soy animal. It was like an android animal, like a golem. And therefore, Yosef only saw them eating it from an animal that was still living, and it bothered him very much, and he had to tell his father that the boys were off. He really thought he was doing the right thing. However, the truth is, they were not doing the wrong thing. And so the Midrash also brings down numerous other examples of things that Yosef had a mistaken identity about what was happening. Yosef was extremely talented. However, we see that Yaakov was Shamer as a Davar, meaning he was reticent and hesitant to stop the things that were happening. Though he did Mochiach Yosef in the second dream of the 11 stars, the sun, the moon bowing down to him, nevertheless, Yaakov loved his son so much, and he wasn't really aware of how far things were going with the hatred towards Yosef. So much to the point where he actually sent them to go after the boys. So therefore we see the reason that the 10 brothers, and particularly the brothers, was really just the brothers of Leah's sons, which were really the problem, hated Yosef so much to the point because they actually thought Yosef was endeavoring to get them kicked out of the Jewish nation, and they knew they were doing the right thing, and yet nevertheless Yosef was passing on messages to the father of evil reports of things that they were doing. It wasn't true Lashon Hara because he had the good in mind and he was trying to help them, but he also didn't know the circumstances of the case and didn't speak to them first to clarify the circumstances of the case. And this is the reason why they did what they did. Now, just to speak a little bit about the actual incidents themselves, I'd like to open up the Parsha. Now it says that Yosef was a youth with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Again, because of what happened to Rachel, Yosef's special relationship with the father, he was rejected by the sons of Leah, and therefore he was not able to get close to find out what they were really up to. And he hung out with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, which were sons which were not as, I don't want to say not as high of a level, but not as much of the ikar of the main sons, let's say, of the most important sons of Yaakov. Though every Jew, every one is deserving of blessing, and every one of the sons brings down God's light into the world. Nevertheless, there were particular sons, such as the sons of Leah and the sons of Rachel, which seemed to be more prominent sons, and therefore Bilhah and Zilpah, which were the less prominent sons, Yosef seemed to hang out with them. Though he was a precocious, intelligent, good-looking, learned son, he was rejected by the sons of Leah. And this constant alienation between them caused the problems. What's really interesting is that what we see is that this idea, a very central idea, is being developed throughout Bereshis, which I haven't really seen talked about too much, but it's this idea of the younger, the more befitting, having the rights and the power to overcome the natural order of the stronger, the firstborn, in order to take the portion. We see that Yishmael was the firstborn, and Avram wanted to give him blessings, but nevertheless, Yitzhak was a higher level, and Sarah the prophetess was able to point that out. And so we see right away, even though the natural law built into the world was the Bechor, was the way of the nations, that all the nations in the world always favored the first son because there's a certain rachis oni, there's a certain initial strength that came with the first son. Nevertheless, the idea of the Jewish people is that the blessing, not by might, not by power, comes to the one who's the most befitting, the most godly son. And Yitzhak gets that blessing. And so too Yaakov. Even though they were struggling, Yaakov ended up being the second son. And nevertheless, he took the Bechorah, the right of the firstborn, and the bracha from Esav. And this was highly questionable. So questionable that we see, and we talked about last week's Parsha, that Yaakov himself had a lot of doubt about whether he deserved the bracha or not. And that's why when he defeated the angel of Esav, he actually asked for the bracha himself to receive that blessing. We see this as a common theme happening over and over again. And so too here. Ruvain is the firstborn. Nevertheless, Yosef is the favored one, and Yaakov decides that he is going to favor Yosef, and the other brothers were so afraid that it was going to lead to their demise. However, of course, we know, as we learned, that was not true. Things had changed. But nevertheless, Yosef did end up getting the rights of the Bechor in some of ways. According to some opinions, Ruvain did still take it, according to the blessings that we see in Parshas V'yechi. But however, on the other hand, Yosef's sons did get a double portion in the land. Menashe and Ephraim got a double portion. So we see that Yosef did indeed, the younger, more befitting son, got the blessings of the father. And this was a revolutionary idea in the world at the time, and for even some time afterwards. The idea was the Bechor, the firstborn, the strongest, the most father-like of all the children, would be the blessed one. But the idea of the Jewish people, again, is not by might and not by power, is that the one who is the most befitting, the most blessed, the most bigger of a tzaddik, is the one who gets the blessing. So much to the point that it causes problems over and over again. It causes problems for Yitzhak, where Ishmael wants to kill him. It causes him for problems with Yaakov, where Esau wants to kill him. And then we see it causes problems with Yosef, where his brothers want to kill him. And we see this over and over again. And what's amazing is at the end of Sefer Bereshis, Yaakov still, at the end, Yosef says, you know what? It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it in a way of all the suffering and separation that Yosef and Yaakov had. And therefore, when Manasseh and Ephraim come along, even though Ephraim, we know, is going to be greater than Manasseh, Yosef says, give the blessing to the order, Yaakov, and give the right hand, put the right hand on the right and the left hand on the left, and the older one, Manasseh, should get the blessing, and the younger one, Ephraim, will not. Yaakov, despite all the travails, holds stubbornly, like a goat, that the right thing to do is always to bless the son, who is more deserved than the other one. And that's why, despite Yosef saying, no, Dad, don't do this again, Yaakov refuses to change his hands and gives the younger Ephraim the blessing over Manasseh. So we see this over and over again, despite all the travails and problems and the worst times of his life that Yaakov had to experience, the loss of Yosef. Nevertheless, Yaakov, at the end of his life, still gives the blessing to the younger over the older. And that is the secret of the Jewish people, is that it's not that we are smaller than the Muslims and the Christians and other nations. It's not about that. We have more Nobel Peace Prizes, we have more Torah, we bring God's light in the world, there are other good things around the world, but nevertheless, it's never been about numbers, it's never been about the rights of the firstborn, it's never been about the strength, it's about doing the right thing and being a tzaddik. And though the brothers made a mistake, nevertheless, we see that the younger Yosef ends up being the one who brings God's light into the world and represents God's tzidkus in the world. Therefore, I want to give everyone a blessing that we, with love all the Jewish people, as in the end we see the great reconciliation between all the tribes at the end of the Torah. In Parshas Meketz of Yigash, the story continues, and we'll speak more about the reconciliation and about how, in the lowest of lows, there's the redemption of the Jewish people comes out. Meaning is, in this week's Parsha, after Yehuda could have stepped up and could have been the brother to save Yosef, and he falls so low that he loses 2 sons and leaves the people for a while. Nevertheless, from this great fall, Mashiach is destined to come. And we'll speak about that more in the weeks to come. Everyone should have a great week and a good Shabbos. Thank you very much. This is Rabbi Adam Law from Or Yisrael and Toronto Lights. Be well. God bless.